What would you do if you discovered that the place where you live harbors a secret so dark that it could cost you your life? In the depths of the American South, where Spanish moss hangs like ghostly curtains and shadows seem to have a life of their own, the Whitmore Plantation holds a mystery that has claimed lives for generations. This is not just a story about slavery. It's a story about human resilience, the power of unity, and the courage to face the unthinkable. Before we dive into this chilling tale, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens next. The Georgia heat hung thick as molasses over the Whitmore Plantation in the summer of 1858. Spanish moss draped the ancient oak trees like funeral shrouds, and the air itself seemed to carry secrets that no one dared speak aloud. Among the rows of cotton that stretched toward the horizon, 6 young men worked under the merciless sun, their backs bent, but their spirits not yet broken. Samuel, at 22, was the unofficial leader of their group. His calloused hands moved with practiced efficiency through the cotton bolls, but his mind was always working, always planning. Born on the plantation, he had watched his parents work themselves to death in these very fields, and he carried their memory like a sacred flame in his heart. His broad shoulders and steady gaze commanded respect from both the enslaved and the overseers. Though he was careful never to appear too confident in front of the white folks, beside him worked Marcus, 19 and built like a young bull, whose quiet strength had earned him respect among both the enslaved and the overseers. Marcus had arrived at Whitmore 3 years ago, sold from a failing tobacco farm in Virginia. The separation from his family had left deep scars on his soul. But he had found new brothers in this group of friends. His hands, massive and powerful, could pick cotton faster than anyone else on the plantation, but they were also gentle enough to tend to injured birds or comfort a crying child. There was also David, barely 18 but wise beyond his years, whose ability to read, a dangerous skill he kept hidden, made him invaluable to their small circle. David's mother had been a house servant before her death, and she had secretly taught him letters and numbers by scratching them in the dirt behind the kitchen. His keen intelligence and quick wit had saved the group from punishment more times than they could count, and his ability to understand the white folks' conversations often provided crucial information about plantation business. The other 3 were equally important to their tight-knit group. Thomas, 21, whose quick wit had saved them from punishment more times than they could count. Thomas possessed an almost supernatural ability to read people's moods and intentions, a skill that had kept him alive through 3 different masters before he ended up at Whitmore. His humor, even in the darkest times, was like a light that kept their spirits from breaking completely. Benjamin, 20, whose gentle nature masked a fierce loyalty to his friends, had been born with a clubfoot that made him slower in the fields, but gave him a different perspective on survival. His grandmother had been a healer, and she had passed down to him knowledge of herbs and remedies that he used to help his fellow enslaved people. Despite his physical limitation, Benjamin possessed a courage that ran deeper than any of them realized. And Joseph, the youngest at 17, whose keen eyes missed nothing that happened on the plantation. Joseph had an almost photographic memory and could recall conversations, patterns and details with startling accuracy. His youth made him appear harmless to the overseers, allowing him to move around the plantation with relative freedom and gather information that others couldn't access. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson, the 6 friends gathered near the slave quarters. It was their daily ritual, a few precious moments to share news, concerns, and the small comforts that friendship could provide in their harsh reality. They had learned to communicate in whispers, in glances, in subtle gestures that wouldn't attract unwanted attention. "You all notice how quiet it's been lately," Samuel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The others nodded, understanding immediately what he meant. For the past month, an unusual stillness had settled over the plantation, broken only by the occasional sound of Mistress Whitmore's footsteps echoing from the main house. Even the birds seemed to sing less frequently, and the usual chatter among the enslaved people had dwindled to nervous murmurs. Eleanor Whitmore was a woman who commanded attention without saying a word. Tall and elegant, with silver hair always pulled back in a perfect chignon, she moved through the plantation like a spectre. Her late husband had left her the estate 5 years ago, and since then she had run it with an iron fist wrapped in silk gloves. But there was something else about her, something that made even the bravest among the enslaved people lower their eyes when she passed. Unlike other plantation mistresses who might occasionally show moments of humanity or kindness, Eleanor Whitmore seemed to exist in a realm entirely separate from normal human emotion. Her pale blue eyes never showed warmth, never reflected compassion or mercy. When she looked at the enslaved people, it was with the same detached interest one might show when examining livestock or farm equipment. She spoke rarely, and when she did, her voice carried an authority that seemed to come from somewhere deeper and darker than mere social position. "It ain't natural the way she looks at us," Marcus muttered, glancing toward the main house where a single light flickered in an upper window. "Like she's measuring us for something. My mama used to tell stories about women like her, women who made deals with dark forces for power and beauty." David, who had learned to read by watching the Whitmore children's lessons from afar, had overheard conversations that chilled him to the bone. "I heard the house servants talking," he said quietly. "They say she's been asking questions about us, about our ages, our health, our strength. Old Martha told me the mistress has been going through the plantation records, studying them like she's looking for something specific." The group fell silent. They all knew about the room, the one the older enslaved people called the dark room. It was located in a side annex of the main house, accessible through a heavy wooden door that was always slightly ajar. A faint, pulsing light emanated from within, visible only at night, and no one could explain its source. The older folks whispered that the room had been there since the plantation's founding, that it had been built for purposes that decent people shouldn't think about. "My grandmother told me stories," Benjamin said, his voice trembling slightly. "She said that room has been there since the plantation was built. Said the first Master Whitmore used it for things, dark things. She called it the hungry room because it was never satisfied, always wanting more." Benjamin's grandmother had lived to be 93, an almost impossible age for an enslaved person, and she had seen things that haunted her dreams until the day she died. Thomas, ever the skeptic, shook his head. "Stories, Ben, just stories to keep us in line. White folks love it when we're scared of ghosts and spirits. Keeps us from thinking about real problems, real resistance." But Joseph, whose youth made him more observant than cautious, had noticed something the others hadn't. "Remember Isaac?" he asked suddenly. The others tensed at the mention of the name. Isaac had been a strong young man, about Samuel's age, who had simply vanished 3 months ago. One day he was there, working the fields, laughing with his friends, and the next morning his bunk was empty. The overseers claimed he had run away, but Isaac had never shown any inclination to flee. He had been planning to marry Sarah, a young woman from the neighboring plantation, and had been saving every small privilege and favor he could earn to make their future wedding possible. "And before Isaac there was Caleb," Joseph continued, his voice growing more urgent. "And before Caleb there was Moses. All of them young, all of them strong, and all of them—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. They all knew the pattern now that Joseph had pointed it out. Young men in their prime, healthy and vital, disappearing without explanation or trace. Samuel felt a chill run down his spine, despite the warm evening air. "You think there's a pattern?" "I know there is," Joseph replied with the certainty of youth. "I've been watching, listening. Every few months, Mistress Whitmore calls one of us to the main house after dark. They go in through the side door, the one that leads to that room, and they never come back. The overseers always have some explanation. Ran away, sold to another plantation, sent to work in the city, but it's always different and it never quite makes sense." Third, the six friends looked at each other, a terrible understanding beginning to dawn on them. They had all heard the stories, dismissed them as superstition and fear. But now, faced with the possibility that the stories might be true, they felt the weight of their situation settling on their shoulders like a heavy shroud. The plantation, which had always been a prison, now felt like something far worse, a hunting ground where they were the prey. "We need to be careful," Samuel said finally, his voice heavy with the responsibility of leadership. "We need to watch out for each other. If one of us gets called to that house—" "We all go," Marcus finished, his jaw set with determination. "Whatever's in that room, whatever she's doing, we face it together. We're brothers, and brothers don't abandon each other." As if summoned by their words, the sound of footsteps echoed across the plantation yard. The six young men quickly dispersed, pretending to be busy with evening chores, but they all saw her, Mistress Whitmore, standing on the porch of the main house, her pale dress ghostly in the twilight. She was looking directly at them, and even from a distance they could feel the weight of her gaze. There was something predatory in the way she watched them, something that made their skin crawl and their hearts race with primal fear. That night, as they lay in their bunks listening to the sounds of the plantation settling into darkness, none of them could sleep. The pulsing light from the dark room seemed brighter than usual, casting strange shadows on the walls of their quarters, and somewhere in the distance they could swear they heard the sound of that heavy door creaking open and closed, over and over again, like a heartbeat in the darkness. Samuel stared at the ceiling, his mind racing with possibilities and plans. Tomorrow, he decided, they would begin their own investigation. They would uncover the truth about the dark room, about the missing men, and about the woman who held their lives in her perfectly manicured hands. Because if they didn't, he had a terrible feeling that one by one they would all disappear into that pulsing darkness, never to be seen again. The plantation slept, but evil never rested, and in the main house, behind that slightly open door, something waited with infinite patience for its next victim. The darkness was hungry, and it would not be denied much longer. 3 days after their midnight conversation, Samuel's worst fears began to materialize. It started with a knock on the door of their quarters just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in ominous shades of red and purple. Old Martha, the head house servant, stood in the doorway, her weathered face grave, with an expression they had all learned to dread. Martha had served the Whitmore family for over 40 years, and in all that time she had never grown accustomed to this particular duty. "Samuel," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the evening sounds of the plantation. "Mistress wants to see you. Main house. Side door. Now." Martha's hands trembled slightly as she delivered the message, and her eyes held a sorrow so deep it seemed to come from her very soul. She had delivered this same message dozens of times over the decades, and she knew what it meant. She had tried, in her own small ways, to warn the young men, but there was nothing she could do to change their fate. The silence that followed was deafening. The 6 friends exchanged glances, and Samuel could see his own fear reflected in their eyes. This was it, the moment they had all been dreading. The pattern Joseph had identified was continuing, and Samuel was next in line. The weight of inevitability settled over them like a suffocating blanket. "I'll be right there," Samuel replied, his voice steadier than he felt. Martha nodded and disappeared into the gathering darkness, leaving the 6 young men alone with their terror. Samuel could hear his heart pounding in his ears, and his mouth felt dry as cotton. He had always known this day might come, but knowing and experiencing were two entirely different things. "We go together," Marcus said immediately, standing up from his bunk with clenched fists. "We agreed. No one faces this alone." "No." Samuel shook his head firmly, though every fiber of his being wanted to accept his friend's offer. "If we all show up, it'll make things worse. She'll know we're onto something, and then we'll all be dead before we can help anyone." He looked at each of his friends in turn, memorizing their faces, storing up their friendship like treasure against the darkness to come. "But I need you all to watch, from a distance. See what you can see, and if I don't come back—" "You will come back," David interrupted fiercely, his young face set with determination. "We won't let anything happen to you. We'll find a way." Samuel managed a weak smile, though his heart was breaking. "I hope you're right, brother, I really do. But if I don't, promise me you'll keep fighting. Promise me you'll find a way to stop her before she takes anyone else." The friends embraced each other, their brotherhood stronger than blood, their love deeper than the fear that threatened to consume them. Samuel felt their strength flowing into him, giving him courage for what was to come. Whatever happened in that dark room, he would not go quietly. He would fight, he would observe, and if possible, he would find a way to help his friends destroy the evil that had plagued their people for so long. As Samuel made his way across the plantation yard toward the main house, his friends positioned themselves strategically around the grounds. Marcus hid behind the old carriage house, his massive frame concealed in the shadows, but his eyes fixed on the side entrance. David and Thomas took cover near the cotton gin, where they could see both the door and any movement around the main house. Benjamin and Joseph crouched behind a cluster of oak trees that provided a clear view of the side entrance, their hearts pounding as they prepared to witness something that might haunt them for the rest of their lives. The side door stood slightly ajar, just as it always did, with that strange, pulsing light emanating from within. As Samuel approached, he could hear something that made his blood run cold, a low, rhythmic humming, like a lullaby sung in a language he didn't recognize. The sound seemed to come from deep within the house, echoing off the walls in a way that made it impossible to determine its source. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time, like the song of a siren calling sailors to their doom. Samuel paused at the threshold, his hand trembling as he reached for the door handle. The wood was warm to the touch, unnaturally so, and seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as the light within. The brass handle was almost hot, as if it had been sitting in direct sunlight all day, though the evening air was cool and pleasant. Taking a deep breath, Samuel whispered a prayer to whatever gods might be listening and pushed the door open. The room beyond was unlike anything he had ever seen. The walls were lined with shelves containing glass jars filled with strange floating objects that he couldn't identify. Some of the jars contained what looked like wisps of smoke or fog, while others held substances that glowed with their own inner light. Candles flickered in wall sconces, their flames dancing in patterns that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Sometimes burning blue, sometimes green, sometimes colors that had no names. The floor was covered with intricate symbols carved directly into the wooden planks, filled with what looked like silver or mercury that caught and reflected the candlelight. The air itself felt thick and oppressive, charged with an energy that made Samuel's skin crawl and his hair stand on end. And in the center of the room stood Mistress Whitmore, dressed in a flowing white gown that seemed to glow with its own inner light. "Samuel," she said, her voice soft and melodious, completely different from the cold, commanding tone she used during the day. "I've been waiting for you. You're exactly what I need. Young, strong, full of life and vitality." Her smile was radiant and terrible, like the beauty of a poisonous flower. "Yes, ma'am," Samuel replied, his training in subservience overriding his fear, though his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "You wanted to see me." Mistress Whitmore moved closer to him, with fluid, almost floating steps, and Samuel could see that her feet barely seemed to touch the ground. Her skin was pale as moonlight and seemed to have a faint luminescence as if lit from within. Her eyes, which he had always thought were blue, now appeared to be silver, reflecting the candlelight like mirrors. "Oh, my dear boy," she said, reaching out to touch his face with fingers that felt like ice. "I have such wonderful plans for you. You're going to help me maintain something very precious, something that has kept my family strong and beautiful for generations." Her touch sent waves of cold through his body, and Samuel felt his strength beginning to ebb away, as if she were drawing it out of him through her fingertips. Outside, hidden among the trees, Benjamin and Joseph watched in horror as the light from the room suddenly flared brighter, casting long shadows across the plantation yard. They could see Samuel's silhouette through the window, standing perfectly still as Mistress Whitmore circled him like a predator stalking its prey. The humming grew louder, more insistent, and other voices seemed to join in from somewhere within the house. "We have to do something," Joseph whispered urgently, his young face twisted with anguish. "We can't just let her—" "Wait!" Benjamin hissed, grabbing his friend's arm with surprising strength. "Look! There are others." Through the window, they could see additional figures emerging from the shadows of the room. 3 other people dressed in similar white robes, their faces hidden by hoods. They moved with the same unnatural grace as Mistress Whitmore, and their presence seemed to make the very air in the room shimmer with malevolent energy. Inside the room, Samuel felt his consciousness beginning to slip away as the ritual intensified. But he forced himself to stay alert, to observe everything he could. He noticed the arrangement of the jars on the shelves, the way certain symbols on the floor glowed brighter than others, and most importantly, he saw a single jar positioned at the center of the highest shelf that seemed to pulse with a different kind of light, older, more powerful, more fundamental than the others. Through the window, they could see Mistress Whitmore raising her hands towards Samuel, her fingers moving in intricate patterns that seemed to leave trails of light in the air. Samuel remained motionless, his head tilted back as if he were in a trance, but his eyes were still moving, still observing, still fighting against the dark magic that sought to claim him. The humming grew louder, more insistent, and the very air around the house seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly energy. The other robed figures began to chant in harmony, their voices weaving together in a pattern that seemed to pull at the very fabric of reality. The jars on the shelves began to glow brighter, their contents swirling and pulsing in response to the ritual. Then, suddenly, Samuel collapsed. "No!" Joseph started to rise from their hiding place, tears streaming down his young face. But Benjamin pulled him back down with desperate strength. "If we go in there now, we'll just end up like him," Benjamin whispered fiercely, though his own heart was breaking. "We need to think. We need a plan. Samuel wouldn't want us to throw our lives away uselessly." Inside the room, Mistress Whitmore knelt beside Samuel's unconscious form, her hands glowing with that same strange light. She placed her palms on his chest and began to chant in that unknown language, her voice rising and falling in a hypnotic rhythm. The jars on the shelves began to glow brighter, their contents swirling and pulsing in response to her words, as if they were feeding on the energy being drawn from Samuel's body. From their various hiding places, the 5 remaining friends watched in helpless horror as their leader disappeared into whatever dark ritual Mistress Whitmore was performing. The light from the room grew so bright that it was visible from every corner of the plantation, yet somehow none of the other enslaved people seemed to notice. It was as if the entire event was happening in a bubble of reality, separate from the rest of the world. Hours passed like centuries. The friends took turns watching, afraid to leave their posts, but terrified of what they might see. As dawn approached, the light finally began to fade, and Mistress Whitmore emerged from the room alone, walking across the plantation yard with her usual elegant composure, as if nothing unusual had happened. The side door swung shut behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo across the entire plantation, and the strange, pulsing light disappeared entirely. Samuel was gone. When the morning bell rang for the start of the workday, the 5 remaining friends gathered at their usual spot, their faces drawn with exhaustion and grief. Samuel's absence was like a physical wound, a constant reminder of their helplessness in the face of whatever evil had taken their friend. The world seemed dimmer without his steady presence, and they all felt lost without his leadership. "We have to tell someone," Thomas said desperately, his usual humor completely absent. "The other workers, the overseers, someone who can what?" Marcus interrupted bitterly, his massive hands clenched into fists. "Who's going to believe us? Who's going to care about one missing slave when the mistress says he ran away? They'll just say we're making up stories, and then we'll all be punished for spreading lies." David, who had been silent since Samuel's disappearance, finally spoke up, his young voice heavy with grief and determination. "She's going to come for another one of us, soon. Joseph was right about the pattern. Every few months she takes someone new. We have maybe 2 or 3 months before she calls the next one. Then we use that time," Benjamin said with quiet determination, his gentle nature hardened by loss into something stronger. "We learn everything we can about that room, about what she's doing, about how to stop her. Samuel died trying to save us all. We can't let his sacrifice be meaningless." "And how exactly do we do that?" Thomas asked, though his tone suggested he was ready to try anything, no matter how dangerous. Joseph, whose keen observation skills had first identified the pattern, looked toward the main house with a mixture of fear and resolve burning in his young eyes. "We watch, we listen, and we find a way into that room when she's not there. Because whatever happened to Samuel, whatever happened to all the others, the answer is in there. And if we're going to die anyway, we might as well die fighting." The 5 young men stood together in the growing daylight, bound by grief and determination stronger than any chains. They had lost their leader, their friend, their brother, but they would not let his sacrifice be in vain. Somehow, some way, they would uncover the truth about the dark room and the woman who used it to steal their people away. As they dispersed to begin another day of back-breaking labor, none of them noticed the figure watching them from an upper window of the main house. Mistress Whitmore stood perfectly still, her pale hands pressed against the glass, a satisfied smile playing at the corners of her mouth. The ritual had been successful, more so than she had dared hope. Samuel's strength, his life force, his very essence now flowed through her veins, adding to the power she had accumulated over the decades. But she was still hungry, still incomplete, and there were 5 more young, strong men just waiting to feed her insatiable appetite for human energy. The next harvest would come soon, and she would be ready. Soon, she thought to herself, her silver eyes gleaming with anticipation. Very soon she would call the next one. 2 months had passed since Samuel's disappearance, and the remaining 5 friends had used every moment to gather information about the mysterious room and its dark purposes. What they discovered was far worse than any of them had imagined, a horror that stretched back through generations and touched every aspect of the plantation's existence. David, using his secret ability to read, had managed to access some of the old plantation records hidden in the overseer's office. Working by candlelight in the dead of night, risking severe punishment if caught, he had uncovered a horrifying pattern that stretched back over 50 years. The Whitmore family had been practicing something unspeakable since the plantation's founding, and Eleanor Whitmore was merely the latest in a long line of practitioners. The records were kept in a locked chest beneath the overseer's desk, written in multiple hands over the decades. Some entries were in English, others in Latin, and a few in languages that David couldn't identify. But the meaning was clear enough: detailed accounts of rituals, of harvests, of the systematic murder of enslaved people for purposes that made his blood run cold. "Listen to this," David whispered to his friends as they huddled together in an abandoned tobacco barn, far from prying eyes and ears. He held a yellow document in his trembling hands, the paper so old it threatened to crumble at his touch. This is from 1820, written by the first Master Whitmore. He calls it the preservation ritual, and says it requires the life essence of the young and strong to maintain the family's vitality and power. Marcus felt sick to his stomach, his massive frame shaking with rage and revulsion. "You mean they've been doing this for decades? Killing our people to... what? Stay young? Stay beautiful?" "It's worse than that," David continued, his voice barely audible as he read from another document. "According to this, they don't just kill them. They trap their souls, their life force, in those jars we saw in the room. The victims become a source of power that the family can draw from indefinitely. Listen to this entry from 1835. The vessel containing young Moses continues to provide excellent vitality after 3 years of service. His essence burns bright and pure, a testament to the strength of his spirit." Benjamin, who had been unusually quiet since Samuel's disappearance, suddenly looked up with haunted eyes. The gentle young man had aged years in the past 2 months, his face gaunt from sleepless nights and constant worry. "That explains why she looks the same as she did when I was a child. My grandmother used to tell stories about Eleanor Whitmore, said she'd been beautiful and young for as long as anyone could remember. We thought it was just good breeding, good living. But it's not. She's been stealing our lives to preserve her own." The revelation hit them like a physical blow. Not only had their friend been murdered, but his very soul was trapped, being used to fuel the unnatural life of their oppressor. The injustice of it, the sheer evil of it, was almost too much to bear. Samuel, with his kind heart and protective nature, was being used to sustain the very woman who had destroyed him. Thomas, who had been pacing back and forth like a caged animal, his usual humor completely absent, suddenly stopped. "We have to destroy those jars. If Samuel's soul is trapped in there, if all their souls are trapped, we have to set them free. We owe them that much." "And how exactly do we do that?" Joseph asked, though his tone suggested he was ready to attempt anything, no matter how dangerous. "We don't even know how to get into that room when she's not there, and even if we could, what if there are protections, traps? Magic we don't understand." But David had been thinking about this problem for weeks, studying the patterns of the household, observing the routines of everyone on the plantation. "I've been watching her patterns. Every Sunday night she leaves the plantation, takes her carriage into town, doesn't come back until Monday morning, says she's visiting her sister. But I think she's meeting with others like her, other families who practice the same rituals." The idea that there were others, that this evil extended beyond their plantation, was almost too horrifying to contemplate. How many plantations across the South harbored similar secrets? How many families had built their wealth and power on the stolen lives of enslaved people? "That gives us maybe 8 hours, Marcus calculated, his mind working through the logistics despite his emotional turmoil. 8 hours to get into that room, figure out how to destroy the jars, and get out without being caught. "It's not enough time," Benjamin protested, his gentle nature making him cautious even in the face of such evil. "We don't know what kind of protection she might have on that room, what kind of traps or magical defenses. What if we trigger something that alerts her? What if we make things worse?" "It has to be enough," David interrupted firmly, his young face set with determination that reminded them all of Samuel. Because if we don't try, we're all going to end up like Samuel and Isaac and Caleb and Moses and all the others whose names we don't even know. David had found more records, older ones, that detailed decades of disappearances. Young men and women taken in their prime, their life force harvested to feed the unnatural appetites of the Whitmore family. The scale of the horror was staggering. Hundreds of people over the years, all reduced to nothing more than fuel for dark magic. As if to emphasize his point, the sound of footsteps echoed across the plantation yard. The five friends quickly extinguished their candle and peered through the gaps in the barn walls. In the distance, they could see a familiar figure approaching the slave quarters. Old Martha, walking with the same grave expression they had seen 2 months ago, her weathered face heavy with sorrow and resignation. "No," Marcus breathed, his voice barely audible. "Not yet. It's too soon." But they all knew it wasn't too soon. The pattern was accelerating. Mistress Whitmore's hunger was growing stronger, more urgent, fed by the success of her recent harvest. Samuel's life force had been particularly potent, and it had awakened something in her that demanded more, demanded it sooner. As they watched in horror, Martha stopped in front of their quarters and called out a name that made their blood run cold. "Marcus! Mistress wants to see you. Main house, side door, now." The five friends looked at each other in the darkness of the barn, and Marcus felt his legs go weak. This was it. His turn, his death sentence. But unlike Samuel, he wouldn't go in blind. They had learned things, discovered secrets that might make a difference. "We're not waiting until Sunday," David said with quiet determination, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "We're going tonight, after the ritual, when she thinks she's safe, when she's weakened from the effort. That's when we strike." "But Marcus," Joseph started to protest, his young voice cracking with emotion. "We'll be dead by then," Marcus finished grimly, accepting his fate with the courage that had always defined him. "Just like Samuel. But maybe, if you can destroy those jars, maybe our souls can find peace. Maybe we can finally be free." Thomas grabbed Marcus's arm, his grip desperate and fierce. "There has to be another way. We could run, all of us, head north, find the underground railroad, and leave everyone else here to die?" Marcus shook his head, his decision already made. "No, this ends tonight. One way or another, this ends tonight. Even if we all die, at least we'll die fighting. At least we'll die trying to save others." The friends embraced each other, knowing it might be the last time they were all together. Marcus walked toward his fate with his head held high, while the others prepared for what might be a suicide mission. But they had learned something important in their investigation. The jars weren't just containers, they were prisons. And every prison could be broken if you knew how. As Marcus approached the side door of the main house, he could see the same pulsing light emanating from within, but this time he was ready for it. Hidden in his pocket was a small piece of iron that David had given him, something he had read about in the old records, a metal that supposedly offered some protection against dark magic. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. The door swung open at his approach, and Mistress Whitmore stood waiting, dressed in the same flowing white gown. But this time, Marcus was looking at her with new eyes. He could see the unnatural pallor of her skin, the way her eyes seemed to glow with an inner light that wasn't entirely human. She was beautiful, yes, but it was the terrible beauty of a predator that had fed well on the lives of others. "Marcus," she said in that same melodious voice that had lured Samuel to his doom, "how lovely to see you again. You're even stronger than Samuel was, aren't you? More vital, more alive. You'll serve my purposes beautifully." "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied, his hand closing around the piece of iron in his pocket, feeling it grow warm against his palm. As Mistress Whitmore began her ritual, Raising her hands and starting to chant in that unknown language, Marcus felt the iron growing warm against his palm. The metal seemed to be fighting